When Sweetbread's meat and canning factory opened at 8, Inspector Flint was waiting at the gate. He stormed into the manager's office and demanded to speak to him. "Oh, he's not here yet," said the secretary. "Is there anything I can do for you?" "I want a list of every establishment you supply with pork pies, steak and kidney pies, sausages and dog food," said the inspector. "I can't possibly give you that information," said the secretary. "It's extremely confidential." "Confidential? What the hell do you mean, confidential?" "Well, I don't know, really. It's just that I couldn't take it on myself to provide you with inside information." She stopped. Inspector Flint was staring at her with a quite horrible expression on his face. "Well, miss," he said finally, "while we're on the topic of inside information, it may interest you to know that what has been inside your pork pies is by way of being inside information. Vital information." "Vital information? Don't know what you mean. Our pies contain perfectly wholesome ingredients." "Wholesome?" shouted the inspector. "You call 3 human bodies wholesome? You call the boiled, bleached, minced and cooked remains of 3 murdered bodies wholesome?" "But we only use—" the secretary began and fell sideways off her chair in a dead faint. "Oh, for God's sake," shouted the inspector. "You think a silly bitch you can work in an abattoir wouldn't be squeamish? Find out who the manager is and where he lives and tell him to come down here at the double." He sat down in a chair while Sergeant Yates rummaged in the desk. "Wakey, wakey," he said, prodding the secretary with his foot. "If anyone's got a right to lie down on the job, it's me. I've been on my feet for 3 days and nights, and I've been an accessory after the fact of murder." "An accessory?" said Yates. "I don't see how you can say that." "Can't you? Well, what would you call helping to dispose of parts of a murder victim, concealing evidence of a crime?" "Oh, I never thought about it that way," said Yates. "I did," said the inspector. "I can't think of anything else." In his cell, Wilt stared up at the ceiling peacefully. He was astonished that it had been so easy. All you had to do was to tell people what they wanted to hear, and they'd believe you no matter how implausible your story might be. And 3 days and nights without sleep had suspended Inspector Flint's disbelief with a vengeance. Then again, Wilt's hesitations had been timed perfectly, and his final confession a nice mixture of conceit and matter-of-factness. On the details of the murder, he'd been coldly precise, and in describing their disposal, he'd been a craftsman, taking pride in his work. Every now and then, when he got into a difficult spot, he would veer away into a manic arrogance, at once boastful and cowardly, with, "You'll never be able to prove it. They've disappeared without trace now." And the Harpe could come in useful once again, adding a macabre touch of realism about evidence being flushed down thousands of U-bends, with harpic being poured after it like salt from a salt cellar. Eva would enjoy that when he told her about it, which was more than could be said for Inspector Flint. He hadn't even seen the irony of Wilt's remark, that while he'd been looking for the Pringsheims, they'd been under his nose all the time. He'd been particularly upset by the crack about gut reactions and the advice to stick to health foods in future. Yes, in spite of his tiredness, Wilt had enjoyed himself, watching the inspector's bloodshot eyes turn from glee and gloating self-satisfaction to open amazement and finally undisguised nausea. And when finally Wilt had boasted that they would never be able to bring him to trial without the evidence, Flint had responded magnificently. "Oh, yes, we will," he shouted hoarsely. "If there is one single pie from that batch, we'll get it. And when we do, the lab boys will—" "Find nothing but pork in it," said Wilt before being dragged off to his cell. At least that was the truth, and if Flint didn't believe it, that was his own fault. He had asked for confession, and he had got one, courtesy of Meat One, the apprentice butchers who had spent so many hours of liberal studies explaining the workings of Sweetbread's meat factory to him, and had actually taken him down there one afternoon to show him how it all worked. Dear lads, and how he'd loathed them at the time, which only went to show how wrong you could be about people. Wilt was just wondering if he'd been wrong about Eva, and perhaps she was dead, when he fell asleep. In the churchyard, Eva watched the Reverend St. John Froude walk down to the boathouse and start rowing towards the reeds. As soon as he'd disappeared, she made her way up the path towards the house. With the vicar out of the way, she was prepared to take the risk of meeting his wife. She stole through the doorway into the courtyard and looked about her. The place had a dilapidated air about it and a pile of empty bottles in one corner, whiskey and gin bottles, and seemed to indicate that he might well be unmarried. Still clutching her ivy, she went across to the door, evidently the kitchen door, and knocked. There was no answer. She crossed to the window and looked inside. The kitchen was large, distinctly untidy, and had all the hallmarks of a bachelor existence about it. She went back to the door and knocked again, and she was just wondering what to do now when there was a sound of a vehicle coming down the drive. Eva hesitated for a second and then tried the door. It was unlocked. She stepped inside and shut the door as a milk van drove into the courtyard. Eva listened while the milkman put down several bottles and then drove away. Then she turned and went down the passage to the front hall. If she could find the phone, she could ring Henry, and he could come out in the car and fetch her. She would go back to the church and wait for him there. But the hall was empty. She poked her head into several rooms with a good deal of care, and found them largely bare of furniture or with dust covers over chairs and sofas. The place was incredibly untidy, too. Definitely the vicar was a bachelor. Finally, she found his study. There was a phone on the desk. Eva went over and lifted the receiver and dialed Ipford 66066. There was no reply. Henry would be at the tech. She dialed the tech number and asked for Mr. Wilt. "Wilt," said the girl on the switchboard. "Mr. Wilt?" "Yes," said Eva in a low voice. "I'm afraid he's not here," said the girl. "Not there? But he's got to be there." "Well, he isn't." "But he's got to be. It's desperately important I get in touch with him." "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," said the girl. But Eva began and glanced out of the window. The vicar had returned and was walking up the garden path towards her. "Oh, God," she muttered, and put the phone down hurriedly. She turned and rushed out of the room in a state of panic. Only when she had made her way back up the passage to the kitchen did it occur to her that she'd left her ivy behind in the study. There were footsteps in the passage. Eva looked frantically round, decided against the courtyard, and went up a flight of stone steps to the first floor. There she stood and listened. Her heart was palpitating. She was naked and alone in a strange house with a clergyman, and Henry wasn't at the tech when he should have been, and the girl on the switchboard had sounded most peculiar, almost as though there was something wrong with wanting to speak to Henry. She had no idea what to do. In the kitchen, the Reverend St. John Froude had a very good idea of what he wanted to do: expunge forever the vision of the inferno to which he had been lured by those vile things with their meaningless messages floating across the water. He dug a fresh bottle of Teacher's out of the cupboard and took it back to his study. What he had witnessed had been so grotesque, so evidently evil, so awful, so prescient of hell itself, that he was in two minds as to whether it had been real or simply a waking nightmare. A man without a face, whose hands were tied behind his back, a woman with a painted face and a knife. The language. The Reverend St. John Froude opened the bottle and was about to pour a glass when his eye fell on the ivy Eva had left on the chair. He put the bottle down hastily and stared at the leaves. Here was another mystery to perplex him. How had a clump of ivy got onto the chair in his study? Certainly hadn't been there when he left the house. He picked it up gingerly and put it on his desk. Then he sat down and contemplated it with a growing sense of unease. Something was happening in his world that he could not understand. And what about the strange figure he had seen flitting about between the tombstones? He'd quite forgotten her. The Reverend St. John Froude got up and went out onto the terrace and down the path to the church. "On a Sunday?" shouted the manager of Sweetbreads. "On a Sunday, but we don't work on a Sunday. There's nobody here. The place is shut." "It wasn't last Sunday, and there was somebody here, Mr. Kidney," said the inspector. "Kedley, please," said the manager. "Kedley with an L." The inspector nodded. "OK, Mr. Kidney. Now, what I'm telling you is that this man Wilt was here last Sunday, and he... How did he get in?" "He used a ladder against the back wall from the car park." "In broad daylight? He'd have been seen." "At 2 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Kidney." "Kedley, Inspector, Kedley." "Look, Mr. Kidley, if you work in a place like this with a name like that, then you're asking for it." Mr. Kidley looked at him belligerently. And if you're telling me that some bloody maniac came in here with 3 dead bodies last Sunday and spent the day using our equipment to convert them into cooked meat edible for human consumption under the Food Regulations Act, I'm telling you that that comes under the head of... head? What do you do with the heads? Tell me that. What do you do with heads, Mr. Kidley? Asked the inspector. Well, rather depends. Some of them go with the offal into the animal food bins. Right. So that's what Wilt said he did with them. And you keep those in the number 2 cold storage room, am I right? Mr. Kidley nodded miserably. Yes, he said. We do. He paused and gaped at the inspector. But there's a world of difference between a pig's head and a... Quite, said the inspector hastily. I dare say you think someone was bound to spot the difference. Well, of course they would. Now, I understand from Mr. Wilt that you have an extremely efficient mincing machine. No, shouted Mr. Kidley desperately. No, I don't believe it. It's not possible. Are you saying he couldn't possibly have? I'm not saying that. I'm saying he shouldn't have. It's monstrous. It's horrible. Of course it's horrible, said the inspector. The fact remains that he used that machine. But we keep our equipment meticulously clean. So Wilt says. He was definite on that point. He says he cleaned up carefully afterwards. Well, he must have done, said Mr. Kidley. There wasn't a thing out of place on Monday morning. You heard the foreman say so. And I also heard this swine Wilt say that he made a list of where everything came from before he used it, so that he could put it back exactly where he found it. He thought of everything. And what about our reputation for hygiene? He didn't think about that, did he? For 25 years we've been known for the excellence of our products, and now this has to happen. We've been at the head of... Mr. Kidley stopped suddenly and sat down. Now then, said the inspector, what I have to know is who you supply to. We're going to call in every pork pie and sausage. Call them in? You can't call them in, screamed Mr. Kidley. They've all gone. Gone? What do you mean they've gone? What I say, they've gone. They've either been eaten or destroyed by now. Destroyed? You're not going to tell me that there aren't any left? It's only 5 days since they went out. Mr. Kidley drew himself up. Inspector, this is an old-fashioned firm, and we use traditional methods, and a sweetbreads pork pie is a genuine pork pie. It's not one of your ersatz pies with preservatives that... It was Inspector Flint's turn to slump into a chair. Am I to understand that your fucking pies don't keep? He asked. Mr. Kidley nodded. They're for immediate consumption, he said proudly. Here today, gone tomorrow. That's our motto. You've seen our advertisements, of course. Inspector Flint hadn't. Today's pie with yesterday's flavour. The traditional pie with the family filling. You can say that again, said Inspector Flint. Mr. Gosdyke regarded Wilt sceptically and shook his head. You should have listened to me, he said. I told you not to talk. I had to say something, said Wilt. They wouldn't let me sleep, and they kept on asking me the same stupid questions over and over again. You've no idea what that does to you. It drives you potty. Frankly, Mr. Wilt, in the light of the confession you've made, I find it hard to believe that there was any need to. A man who can, of his own free will, make a statement like that to the police is clearly insane. But it's not true, said Wilt. It's all pure invention. With a wealth of such revolting detail, I must say I find that hard to believe. I do indeed. The bit about hip and thighs, it makes my stomach turn over. But that's from the Bible, said Wilt. And besides, I had to put in the gory bits or they wouldn't have believed me. Take the part where I say I saw it there. Mr. Wilt, for God's sake. Well, all I can say is you've never taught meat one. I got it all from them, and once you've taught them, life can hold few surprises. Mr. Gosdyke raised an eyebrow. Can't it? Well, I think I can disabuse you of that notion, he said solemnly. In the light of this confession you have made against my most earnest advice, and as a result of my firm belief that every word in it is true, I am no longer prepared to act on your behalf. He collected his papers and stood up. You'll have to get someone else. But, Mr. Gosdyke, you don't really believe all that nonsense about putting Eva in a pork pie, do you? Wilt asked. Believe it? A man who can conceive of such a disgusting thing is capable of anything. Yes, I do. And And what is more, so do the police. They are at the moment scouring the shops, the pubs and the supermarkets and dustbins of the entire county in search of pork pies. But if they find any, it won't do any good. And it may interest you to know that they have impounded 5,000 cans of dog-fill, an equal number of catkin, and have begun to dissect 1/4 ton of Sweetbread's best bangers. Somewhere in that little lot they're bound to find some trace of Mrs. Wilt, not to mention Dr. and Mrs. Pringsheim. Well, all I can say is that I wish them luck, said Wilt. And so do I, said Mr. Gosdyke disgustedly, and left the room. Behind him, Wilt sighed. If only Eva would turn up. Where the hell could she have got to? At the police laboratories, Inspector Flint was getting restive. Can't you speed things up a bit? He asked. The head of the forensic department shook his head. Like looking for a needle in a haystack, he said, glancing significantly at another batch of sausages that had just been brought in. So far, not a trace. This could take weeks. I haven't got weeks, said the inspector. He's due in court on Monday. Only for remand. In any case, you've got his statement. But Inspector Flint had his doubts about that. He'd been looking at that statement, and had noticed a number of discrepancies about it, which fatigue, disgust, and an overwhelming desire to get the filthy account over and done with before he was sick, had tended to obscure at the time. For one thing, Wilt's scrawled signature looked suspiciously like Little Tommy Tucker when examined closely, and there was a QNED beside it, which Flint had a shrewd idea meant quod non erat demonstrandum. And in any case, there were rather too many references to pigs for his policeman's fancy, and fuzzy pigs at that. Finally, the information that Wilt had made a special request for 2 pork pies for lunch, and had specified sweetbreads in particular, suggested an insane cannibalism that might fit in with what he had said he had done, but seemed to be carrying things too far. The word provocation sprang to mind. And since the episode of the doll, Flint had been rather conscious of bad publicity. He read through the statement again and couldn't make up his mind up about it. One thing was quite certain. Wilt knew exactly how Sweetbread's factory worked. The wealth of detail he supplied proved that. On the other hand, Mr. Kidley's incredulity about the heads and the mincing machine had seemed, on inspection, to be justified. Flint had looked gingerly at the beastly contraption, and had found it difficult to believe that even Wilt, in a fit of homicidal mania, could have... Flint put the thought out of his mind. He decided to have another little chat with Henry Wilt. Feeling like death warmed up, he went back to the interview room and sent for Wilt. "How's it going?" said Wilt when he arrived. "Had any luck with the Frankfurters yet? Of course, you could always try your hand at black puddings." "Wilt," interrupted the inspector, "why did you sign that statement, Little Tommy Tucker?" Wilt sat down. "Oh, so you've noticed that at last, have you? Very observant of you, I must say." "I asked you a question." "So you did," said Wilt. "Let's just say I thought it was appropriate." "Appropriate?" "I was singing. I think that's the slang term for it, isn't it? For my sleep. So naturally." "Are you telling me that you made all that up?" "What the hell do you think I did? You don't seriously think that I would inflict the Pringsheims and Eva on an unsuspecting public in the form of pork pies, do you? I mean, there must be some limits to your credulity." Inspector Flint glared at him. "My God, Wilt," he said, "if I find that you've deliberately fabricated a story..." "You can't do very much more," said Wilt. "You've already charged me with murder. What more do you want? You drag me in here, you humiliate me, you shout at me, you keep me awake for days and nights bombarding me with questions about dog food. You announce to the world that I am helping you in your inquiries into a multiple murder, thus leading every citizen in the country to suppose that I've slaughtered my wife and a beastly biochemist and..." "Shut up!" shouted Flint. "I don't care what you think. It's what you've done and what you said you've done that worries me. You've gone out of your way to mislead me." "I've done nothing of the sort," said Wilt. "Until last night I'd told you nothing but the truth, and you wouldn't accept it. Last night I handed you in the absurd shape of a pork pie, a lie you wanted to believe. If you crave crap and use illegal methods like sleep deprivation to get it, you can't blame me for serving it up. Now, don't you come in here and bluster. If you're stupid, that's your problem. Go and find my wife." Someone stop me from killing the bastard, yelled Flint as he hurled himself from the room. He went to his office and sent for Sergeant Yates. Cancel the pie hunt. It's a load of bull, he told him. Bull? Said the sergeant, uncertainly. Shit, said Flint. He's done it again. What do you mean? I mean that the little turd in there has led us up the garden path again. But how did he know all about the factory and all that? Flint looked up at him pathetically. If you want to know why he's a walking encyclopedia, you go and ask him yourself. Sergeant Yates went out and returned 5 minutes later. Mate 1, he announced enigmatically. Mate 1? A class of butchers he used to teach. They took him round the factory. Jesus, said Flint. Is there anybody that little swine hasn't taught? Well, he says they're most instructive. Yates, do me a favour. Just go back and find out all the names of the classes he's taught. That way we'll know what to expect next. Well, I have heard him mention plasterers 1 and gas fitters 1. All of them, Yates. All of them. I don't want to be caught out with some tale about Mrs. Wilt being got rid of in the sewage works because he taught shit too. He picked up the evening paper and glanced at the headlines. Police probe pies for missing wife. Oh, my God, he groaned. This is going to do our public image no end of good. At the Tech, the principal was expressing the same opinion at a meeting of the heads of departments. We've been held up to public ridicule, he said. First, it's popularly supposed that we make a habit of employing lecturers who bury their unwanted wives in the foundations of the new block. Secondly, we've lost all chance of attaining polytechnic status by having the joint honours degree turned down by the CNAA on the grounds that those facilities we do provide are not such as befit an institution of higher learning. Professor Baxendale expressed himself very forcibly on that point, and particularly on a remark he heard from one of the senior staff about necrophilia. Well, I merely said... Dr. Board began. We all know what you said, Dr. Board. And it may interest you to know that Dr. Cox in his lucid moments is still refusing cold meat. Dr. Mayfield has already tendered his resignation, and now to cap it all, we have this. He held up a newspaper, across the top of whose second page there read, Sex Lectures Stun Students. I hope you have all taken good note of the photograph, said the principal bitterly, indicating a large and unfortunately angled picture of Judy hanging from the crane. The article goes on... Well, never mind, you can read it for yourselves. I would merely like answers to the following questions. Who authorized the purchase of 30 copies of Last Exit from Brooklyn for use with fitters and turners? Mr. Morris tried to think who had taken FTs. I think that must have been Watkins, he said. He left us last term. He was only a part-time lecturer. Oh, thank God we were spared him full-time, said the principal. Secondly, which lecturer makes a habit of advocating to nursery nurses that they wear, Dutch caps all the time? Mr. Sedgwick is very keen on them, said Mr. Morris. Nursery nurses or Dutch caps? Inquired the principal. Possibly both together, suggested Dr. Board sotto voce. He's got this thing against the pill, said Mr. Morris. Well, please ask Mr. Sedgwick to see me in my office on Monday at 10. I want to explain the terms under which he is employed here. And finally, how many lecturers do you know who make use of audio-visual aid equipment to show blue movies to the senior sex? Mr. Morris shook his head emphatically. No one in my department, he said. It says here that blue movies have been shown, said the principal, in periods properly allocated to current affairs. Wentworth did show them Women in Love, said the head of English. Well, never mind. There's just one more point I want to mention. We are not going to conduct an evening class in first aid with particular reference to the treatment of abdominal hernia, for which it was proposed to purchase an inflatable doll. From now on, we are going to have to cut our coats to suit our cloth. On the grounds of inflation? Asked Dr. Board. On the grounds that the Education Committee has been waiting for years for an opportunity to cut back our budget, said the principal. That opportunity has now been given them. The fact that we have been providing a public service by keeping, to quote Mr. Morris, a large number of mentally unbalanced and potentially dangerous psychopaths off the streets, unquote, seems to have escaped their notice. And I presume he was referring to the day-release apprentices. said Dr. Board charitably. "He was not," said the principal. "Correct me if I'm wrong, Morris, but hadn't you in mind the members of the Liberal Studies Department?" The meeting broke up. Later that day, Mr. Morris sat down to compose his letter of resignation. 19. From the window of an empty bedroom on the first floor of the vicarage, Eva Wilt watched the Reverend St. John Froude walk pensively down the path to the church. As soon as he'd passed out of sight, she went downstairs and into the study. She would phone Henry again. If he wasn't at the tech, he must be at home. She crossed to the desk and was about to pick up the phone when she saw the ivy. Oh, dear, she'd forgotten all about the ivy, and she'd left it there, where he was bound to have seen it. It was all so terribly embarrassing. She dialed 34 Parkview Avenue and waited. There was no reply. She put the phone down and dialed the tech. And all the time, she watched the gate into the churchyard in case the vicar should return. "Fenland College of Arts and Technology," said the girl on the switchboard. "It's me again," said Eva. "I want to speak to Mr. Wilt." "Well, I'm sorry Mr. Wilt isn't here." "But where is he? I've dialed home and he's at the police station." "He's what?" Eva said. "He's at the police station helping the police with their inquiries." "Inquiries? What inquiries?" Eva shrieked. "Oh, didn't you know?" said the girl. "It's been in all the papers. He's been and murdered his wife." Eva took the phone from her ear and stared at it in horror. The girl was still speaking, but she was no longer listening. Henry had murdered his wife. But she was his wife. It wasn't possible. She couldn't have been murdered. For one horrible moment, Eva Wilt felt sanity slipping away from her. Then she put the receiver to her ear again. "Are you there?" said the girl. "But I am his wife," Eva shouted. There was a long silence at the other end, and she heard the girl telling someone that there was a crazy woman on the line who said she was Mrs. Wilt, and what ought she to do. "I tell you, I am Mrs. Wilt, Mrs. Eva Wilt," she shouted, but the line had gone dead. Eva put the phone down weakly. Henry? At the police station? Henry had murdered her? Oh, God, the whole world had gone mad. And here she was, naked in a vicarage at... Eva had no idea where she was. She dialed 999. "Emergency services? Which department do you require?" said the operator. "Police," said Eva. There was a click, and a man's voice came on. "Police here?" "This is Mrs. Wilt," said Eva. "Mrs. Wilt?" "Mrs. Eva Wilt. Is it true that my husband has murdered... has my husband... Oh, my dear, I don't know what to say." "You say you're Mrs. Wilt, Mrs. Eva Wilt?" said the man. Eva nodded and then said yes. "I see," said the man dubiously. "You're quite sure you're Mrs. Wilt?" "Of course I'm sure. That's what I'm ringing about." "Might I inquire where you're calling from?" "I don't know," said Eva. You see, I'm in this house and I've got no clothes and... Oh, dear. The vicar was coming up the path onto the terrace. "If you could just give us the address." "I can't stop now," said Eva, and put the phone down. For a moment she hesitated. Then, grabbing the ivy from the desk, she rushed out of the room. "I tell you, I don't know where she is," said Wilt. "I expect you'll find her under missing persons. She has passed from the realm of substantiality into that of abstraction." "What the hell do you mean by that?" asked the inspector, reaching for his cup of coffee. It was 11 o'clock on Saturday morning, but he persisted. He had 28 hours to get to the truth. "I always warned her that transcendental meditation carried potential dangers," said Wilt, himself in a no-man's land between sleeping and waking. "But she would do it." "Do what?" "Meditate transcendentally in the lotus position. Perhaps she's gone too far this time. Possibly she has transmogrified herself." "Trans what?" said Inspector Flint suspiciously. "Changed herself in some magical fashion into something else." "Jesus, Wilt, if you start on those pork pies again..." "I was thinking of something more spiritual, Inspector. Something beautiful." "I doubt it." "Oh, but think. Here I am sitting in this room with you as a direct result of going for walks with the dog and thinking dark thoughts about murdering my wife. From those hours of idle fancy, I have gained the reputation of being a murderer without committing a murder. Who's to say but that Eva, whose thoughts were monotonously beautiful, has not earned herself a commensurately beautiful reward? To put it in your terms, Inspector, we get what we ask for." "I frequently hope so, Wilt," said the inspector.
That is the end of this side. The story continues on the other side of this cassette. Side 12.
Ah, said Wilt. But then where is she? Tell me that. Mere speculation will not do. Me tell you? Shouted the inspector, upsetting his cup of coffee. You know which hole in the ground you put her in, or which cement mixer or incinerator you used. I was speaking metaphorically, I mean rhetorically, said Wilt. I was trying to imagine what Eva would be if her thoughts, such as they are, took on the substance of reality. My secret dream was to become a ruthless man of action, decisive, unhindered by moral doubts or considerations of conscience. A Hamlet transformed into Henry V, without the patriotic fervour that inclines one to think that he would not have approved of the common market. A Caesar. Inspector Flint had had enough. Wilt, he snarled, I don't give a damn what you wanted to become. What I want to know is what has become of your wife. I was just coming to that, said Wilt. What we've got to establish first is what I am. I know what you are, Wilt. A bloody word merchant, a verbal contortionist, a fucking logic chopper, a linguistic Houdini, an encyclopedia of unwanted information. Inspector Flint ran out of metaphors. Brilliant, Inspector, brilliant. I couldn't have put it better myself. A logic chopper, but alas, not a wife one. If we follow the same line of reasoning, Eva, in spite of all her beautiful thoughts and meditations, has remained as unchanged as I. The ethereal eludes her. Nirvana slips ever from her grasp. Beauty and truth evade her. She pursues the absolute with a fly swatter and pours Harpic down the drains of hell itself. That's the 10th time you've mentioned Harpic, said the inspector, suddenly alive to a new dreadful possibility. You didn't? Wilt shook his head. There you go again. So like poor Eva, the literal mind that seeks to seize the evanescent and clutches fancy by its non-existent throat. That's Eva for you. She will never dance Swan Lake. No management would ever allow her to fill the stage with water or install a double bed, and Eva would insist. Inspector Flint got up. This is getting us nowhere fast. Precisely, said Wilt. Nowhere at all. We are what we are, and nothing we can do will alter the fact. The mould that forms our natures remains unbroken. Call it heredity, call it chance, call it a load of codswallop, said Flint, and left the room. He needed his sleep, and he intended to get it. In the passage, he met Sergeant Yates. There's been an emergency call from a woman claiming to be Mrs. Wilt, the sergeant said. Where from? She wouldn't say where she was, said Yates. She just said she didn't know, and she had no clothes on. Oh, one of those, said the inspector. A bloody nutter. What the hell are you wasting my time for? As if we didn't have enough on our hands without that. Well, I just thought you'd want to know. If she calls again, we'll try and get a fix on the number. As if I cared, said Flint, and hurried off in search of his lost sleep. The Reverend St. John Froude spent an uneasy day. His investigation of the church had revealed nothing untoward, and there was no sign that an obscene ritual, a black mass had crossed his mind, had been performed there. As he walked back to the vicarage, he was glad to note that the sky over Eel Stretch was empty and that the contraceptives had disappeared. So had the ivy on his desk. He regarded the space where it had been with apprehension and helped himself to whiskey. He could have sworn that there had been a sprig of ivory there when he'd left. By the time he'd finished what remained in the bottle, his mind was filled with weird fancies. The vicarage was strangely noisy. There were odd creaks from the staircase, and inexplicable sounds from the upper floor, as if someone or something was moving stealthily about. But when the vicar went to investigate, the noises ceased abruptly. He went upstairs and poked his head into several empty bedrooms. He came down again and stood in the hall, listening. Then he returned to his study and tried to concentrate on his sermon, but the feeling that he was not alone persisted. Reverend St. John Froude sat at his desk and considered the possibility of ghosts. Something very odd was going on. At 1 o'clock, he went down the hall to the kitchen for lunch and discovered that a pint of milk had disappeared from the pantry and that the remains of an apple pie that Mrs. Snape, who did his cleaning twice weekly, had brought him, had also vanished. He made do with baked beans on toast and tottered upstairs for his afternoon nap. It was while he was there that he first heard the voices, or rather, one voice. It seemed to be coming from his study. The Reverend St. John Froude sat up in bed. If his ears weren't betraying him, and in view of the morning's weird events he was inclined to believe that they were, he could have sworn someone had been using his telephone. He got up and put on his shoes. Someone was crying. He went out onto the landing and listened. The sobbing had stopped. He went downstairs and looked in all the rooms on the ground floor, but apart from the fact that a dust cover had been removed from one of the armchairs in the unused sitting room, there was no sign of anyone. He was just about to go upstairs again when the telephone rang. He went into the study and answered it. "Waterswick Vicarage," he mumbled. "This is Fenland Constabulary," said a man. "We've just had a call from your number, purporting to come from a Mrs. Wilt." "Mrs. Wilt?" said the Reverend St. John Fruit. "Mrs. Wilt? Well, I'm afraid there must have been some mistake. I don't know any Mrs. Wilt." "A call definitely came from your phone, sir." The Reverend St. John Fruit considered the matter. "This is all very peculiar," he said. "I live alone." "You are the vicar?" "Of course I'm the vicar. This is the vicarage, and I am the vicar." "I see, sir. And your name is?" "The Reverend St. John Froude. F-R-O-U-D-E. "Quite, sir. And you definitely don't have a woman in the house?" "Of course I don't have a woman in the house. I find the suggestion distinctly improper. I'm sorry, sir, but we just have to check these things out. We've had a call from Mrs. Wilt, or at least a woman claiming to be Mrs. Wilt, and it came from your phone." "Who is this Mrs. Wilt? I've never heard of a Mrs. Wilt." "Well, sir, Mrs. Wilt... it's a bit difficult, really. She's supposed to have been murdered." "Murdered?" said the Reverend St. John Fruit. "Did you say murdered?" Let us just say she's missing from home in suspicious circumstances. We're holding her husband for questioning." The Reverend St. John Fruit shook his head. "How very unfortunate," he murmured. "Thank you for your help, sir," said the sergeant. "Sorry to have disturbed you." The Reverend St. John Fruit put the phone down thoughtfully. The notion that he was sharing the house with a disembodied and recently murdered woman was not one that he wanted to put to his caller. His reputation for eccentricity was already sufficiently widespread without adding to it. On the other hand, what he'd seen on the boat in Eel Stretch bore, now that he came to think of it, all the hallmarks of murder. Perhaps in some extraordinary way, he had been witness to a tragedy that had already occurred, a sort of post-mortem déjà vu, if that was the right way of putting it. Certainly, if the husband were being held for questioning, the murder must have taken place before. In which case, the Reverend St. John Fruit stumbled through a series of suppositions in which time with a capital T and appeals for help from beyond the grave figured largely. Perhaps it was his duty to inform the police of what he'd seen. He was just hesitating and wondering what to do when he heard those sobs again, and this time quite distinctly. They came from the next room. He got up, braced himself with another shot of whiskey, and went next door. Standing in the middle of the room was a large woman whose hair straggled down over her shoulders and whose face was ravaged. She was wearing what appeared to be a shroud. Reverend St. John Fruit stared at her with a growing sense of horror. Then he sank to his knees. "Let us pray," he muttered hoarsely. The ghastly apparition slumped heavily forward, clutching the shroud to its bosom. Together they knelt in prayer. "Check it out? What the hell do you mean, check it out?" said Inspector Flint, who objected strongly to being woken in the middle of the afternoon when he'd had no sleep for 36 hours and was trying to get some. "You wake me with some damn tomfoolery about a vicar called Sigmund Freud?" "St. John Fruit," said Yates. "I don't care what he's called. It's still improbable. If the bloody man says she isn't there, she isn't there. What am I supposed to do about it?" "Well, I just thought we ought to get a patrol car to check, that's all." "Well, what makes you think?" "There was definitely a call from a woman claiming to be Mrs. Wilt, and it came from that number. She's called twice now. We've got a tape of the second call. She gave details of herself, and they sounded authentic. Date of birth, address, Wilt's occupation, even the right name of their dog, and the fact that they have yellow curtains in the lounge. Well, any fool can tell that. All you've got to do is walk past the house. And the name of the dog. It's called Clem. I've checked that she's right. She didn't happen to say what she's been doing for the past week, did she?" "She said she'd been on a boat," said Yates. "Then she rang off." Inspector Flint sat up in bed. "A boat? What boat?" "She rang off. Oh, and another thing. She says she takes a size 10 shoe. She does." "Oh, shit," said Flint. "All right, I'll come down." He got out of bed and began to dress. In his cell, Wilt stared at the ceiling. After so many hours of interrogation, his mind still reverberated with questions. How did you kill her? Where did you put her? What did you do with the weapon? Meaningless questions continually reiterated in the hope that they would finally break him. But Wilt hadn't broken. He had triumphed. For once in his life, he knew himself to be invincibly right and everyone else totally wrong. Always before he'd had doubts. Plasterers, too, might after all have been right when they said that there were too many wogs in the country. Perhaps hanging was a deterrent. Wilt didn't think so, but he couldn't be absolutely certain. Only time would tell. But in the case of Regina versus Wilt re the murder of Mrs. Wilt, there could be no question of his guilt. He could be tried, found guilty, and sentenced. It would make no difference. He was innocent of the charge, and if he was sentenced to life imprisonment, the very enormity of the injustice done to him would compound his knowledge of his own innocence. For the very first time in his life, Wilt knew himself to be free. It was as though the original sin of being Henry Wilt of 34 Parkview Avenue, Ipford, lecturer in liberal studies at the Fenland College of Arts and Technology, husband of Eva Wilt and father of none, had been lifted from him. All the encumbrances of possessions, habits, salary and status, all the social conformities, the niceties of estimation of himself and other people which he and Eva had acquired, all these had gone. Locked in his cell, Wilt was free to be. And whatever happened, he would never again succumb to the siren calls of self-effacement. After the flagrant contempt and fury of Inspector Flint, the abuse and opprobrium heaped on him for a week, who needed approbation? They could stuff their opinions of him. Wilt would pursue his independent course and put to good use his evident gifts of inconsequence. Give him a life sentence and a progressive prison governor, and Wilt would drive the man mad within a month by the sweet reasonableness of his refusal to obey the prison rules. Solitary confinement and a regime of bread and water, if such punishments still existed, would not deter him. Give him his freedom, and he would apply his newfound talents at the Tech. He would sit happily on committees and reduce them to dissensions by his untiring adoption of whatever argument was most contrary to the consensus opinion. The race was not to the swift, after all. It was to the indefatigably inconsequential, and life was random, anarchic, and chaotic. Rules were made to be broken, and the man with the grasshopper mind was one jump ahead of all the others. Having established this new rule, Wilt turned on his side and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. He tried his other side, with equal lack of success. Thoughts, questions, irrelevant answers, and imaginary dialogues filled his mind. He tried counting sheep, but found himself thinking of Eva. Dear Eva, damnable Eva, ebullient Eva, and Eva irrepressibly enthusiastic. Like him, she had sought the absolute, the eternal truth, which would save her the bother of ever having to think for herself again. She'd sought it in pottery, in transcendental meditation, in judo, on trampolines, and most incongruously of all, in oriental dance. Finally, she'd tried to find it in sexual emancipation, women's lib and the sacrament of the orgasm, in which she could forever lose herself. Which, come to think of it, was what she appeared to have done, and taken the bloody Pringsheims with her. Well, she'd certainly have some explaining to do when and if she ever returned. Wilt smiled to himself at the thought of what she would say when she discovered what her latest infatuation with the infinite had led to. He'd see to it that she had cause to regret it to her dying day. On the floor of the sitting room at the vicarage, Eva Wilt struggled with the growing conviction that her dying day was already over and done with. Certainly everyone she came into contact with seemed to think she was dead. The policeman she'd spoken to on the phone had seemed disinclined to believe her assertion that she was alive and at least relatively well, and had demanded proofs of her identity in the most disconcerting fashion. Eva had retreated stricken from the encounter, with her own confidence in her own continuing existence seriously undermined, and it had only needed the reaction of the Reverend St. John Froude to her appearance in his house to complete her misery. His frantic appeals to the Almighty to rescue the soul of our dear departed one Eva Wilt, deceased, from its present shape and unendurable form, had affected Eva profoundly. She knelt on the carpet and sobbed, while the vicar stared at her over his glasses, shut his eyes, lifted up a shaky voice in prayer, opened his eyes, shuddered, and generally behaved in a manner calculated to cause gloom and despondency in the putative corpse. And when, in a last desperate attempt to get Eva Wilt, deceased, to take her proper place in the heavenly choir, he cut short a prayer about man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live and is full of misery, and struck up Abide with me with many a semi-quaver, Eva abandoned all attempt at self-control and wailed, Fast falls the eventide, most affectingly. By the time she had got to I need thy presence every passing hour, the Reverend St. John Froude was of an entirely contrary opinion. He staggered from the room and took sanctuary in his study. Behind him, Eva Wilt, espousing her new role as deceased, with all the enthusiasm she had formerly bestowed on trampolines, judo, and pottery, demanded to know where death's sting was, and where grave thy victory. As if I bloody knew, muttered the vicar, and reached for the whisky bottle, only to find that it too was empty. He sat down and put his hands over his ears to shut out the dreadful noise. On the whole, Abide with me was the last hymn he should have chosen. He'd have been better off with There is a green hill far away. It was less open to misinterpretation. When at last the hymn ended, he sat relishing the silence, and was about to investigate the possibility that there was another bottle in the larder, when there was a knock on the door, and Eva entered. "Oh, Father, I have sinned," she shrieked, doing her level best to wail and gnash her teeth at the same time. The Reverend St. John Froude gripped the arms of his chair and tried to swallow. It was not easy. Then, overcoming the reasonable fear that delirium tremens had come all too suddenly, he managed to speak. "Rise, my child," he gasped as Eva writhed on the rug before him. "I will hear your confession." 20. Inspector Flint switched the tape recorder off and looked at Wilt. "Well?" "Well, what?" said Wilt. "Is that her? Is that Mrs. Wilt?" Wilt nodded. "I'm afraid so." "What do you mean you're afraid so? A damn woman is alive. You should be fucking grateful. Instead of that, just sit there saying you're afraid so." Wilt sighed. "I was just thinking what an abyss there is between the person as we remember and imagine them and the reality of what they are. I was beginning to have fond memories of her, and now—" "You ever been to Waterswick?" Wilt shook his head. "Never." "Know the vicar there?" "Didn't even know there was a vicar there." "And you wouldn't know how she got there?" "Well, you heard her," said Wilt. "She said she'd been on a boat." "And you wouldn't know anything about a boat, would you?" "People in my circle don't have boats, Inspector. Maybe the Pringsheims have a boat." Inspector Flint considered the possibility and rejected it. They had checked the boatyards out, and the Pringheims didn't have a boat and hadn't hired one either. On the other hand, the possibility that he had been the victim of some gigantic hoax, a deliberate and involved scheme to make him look an idiot, was beginning to take shape in his mind. At the instigation of this infernal Wilt, he had ordered the exhumation of an inflatable doll and had been photographed staring lividly at it at the very moment it changed sex. He had instituted a roundup of pork pies unprecedented in the history of the county. He wouldn't have been at all surprised if Sweetbreads instituted legal proceedings for the damage done to their previously unspotted reputation. And finally, he had held an apparently innocent man for questioning for a week, and would doubtless be held responsible for the delay and additional cost in building the new administration block at the Tech. There were, in all probability, other appalling consequences to be considered, but that was enough to be going on with. And he had nobody to blame but himself. Or Wilt. He looked at Wilt venomously. Wilt smiled. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You don't," said the inspector. "You've no idea." "Oh, that we're all creatures of circumstance, that things are never what they seem, that there's more to this than meets—" "We'll see about that," said the inspector. Wilt got up. "I don't suppose you'll want me for anything else," he said. "I'll be getting along home." "You'll be doing no such thing. You're coming with us to pick up Mrs. Wilt." They went out into the courtyard and got into a police car. As they drove through the suburbs, past the filling stations and factories, and out across the fens, Wilt shrank back into the seat of the car and felt the sense of freedom he'd enjoyed at the police station evaporate. And with every mile it dwindled further, and the harsh reality of choice, of having to earn a living, of boredom and the endless petty arguments with Eva, of bridge on Saturday nights with the Mottrams and drives on Sundays with Eva, reasserted itself. Beside him, sunk in sullen silence, Inspector Flint lost his symbolic appeal. No longer the mentor of Wilt's self-confidence, the foil of his inconsequentiality, he had become a fellow sufferer in the business of living, almost a mirror image of Wilt's own nonentity. And ahead, across this flat, bleak landscape with its black earth and cumulus skies, lay Eva and a lifetime of attempted explanations and counter-accusations. For a moment, Wilt considered shouting, "Stop the car, I want to get out," but the moment passed. Whatever the future held, he would learn to live with it. He had not discovered the paradoxical nature of freedom, only to succumb once more to the servitude of Parkview Avenue, the tech, and Eva's trivial enthusiasms. He was Wilt, the man with the grasshopper mind. Eve was drunk. The Reverend St. John Froude's automatic reaction to her appalling confession had been to turn from whiskey to 150-proof Polish spirit, which he kept for emergencies. And Eva, in between agonies of repentance and the outpourings of lurid sins, had wet her whistle with the stuff. Encouraged by its effect, by the petrified benevolence of the vicar's smile, and by the growing conviction that if she was dead, eternal life demanded an act of absolute contrition, while, if she wasn't, it allowed her to avoid the embarrassment of explaining what precisely she was doing naked in someone else's house, Eva confessed her sins with an enthusiasm that matched her deepest needs. This was what she'd sought in judo, and pottery, and oriental dance, an orgiastic expiation of her guilt. She confessed sins that she'd committed and sins she hadn't, sins that had occurred to her and sins she had forgotten. She had betrayed Henry. She had wished him dead. She had lusted after other men. She was an adulterated woman. She was a lesbian. She was a nymphomaniac. And interspersed with these sins of the flesh, there were sins of omission. Eva left nothing out. Henry's cold suppers, his lonely walks with the dog, her lack of appreciation for all that he'd done for her, her failure to be a good wife, her obsession with Harpic, everything poured out. In his chair, the Reverend St. John Froude sat nodding incessantly like a toy dog in the back window of a car, raising his head to stare at her when she confessed to being a nymphomaniac, and dropping it abruptly at the mention of Harpic. And all the time, desperately trying to understand what had brought her, fat, naked, the shroud kept falling off her, lady, no, definitely not lady, woman, to his house with all the symptoms of religious mania upon her. "My child, is that all?" he muttered when Eva finally exhausted her repertoire. "Yes, Father," sobbed Eva. "Thank God," said the Reverend St. John Froude fervently, and wondered what to do next. If half the things he'd heard were true, he was in the presence of a sinner so depraved as to make the ex-Archdeacon of Ongar a positive saint. On the other hand, there were incongruities about her sins that made him hesitate before granting absolution. A confession full of falsehoods was no sign of true repentance. "I take it that you are married," he said doubtfully, "and that Henry is your lawful wedded husband." "Yes," said Eva. "Dear Henry." Poor sod, thought the vicar, but he was too tactful to say so. "And you have left him?" "Yes." "For another man?" Eva shook her head. "To teach him a lesson," she said with sudden belligerence. "A lesson?" said the vicar, trying frantically to imagine what sort of lesson the wretched Mr. Wilt had learned from her absence. "You did say a lesson." "Yes," said Eva. "I wanted him to learn that he couldn't get along without me." The Reverend St. John Froude sipped his drink thoughtfully. If even a quarter of her confession was to be believed, her husband must be finding getting along without her quite delightful. "And now you want to go back to him?" "Yes," said Eva. "But he won't have you." "He can't. The police have got him." The police?" said the vicar. "And may one ask what the police have got him for?" "They say he murdered me," said Eva. The Reverend St. John Froude eyed her with new alarm. He knew now that Mrs. Wilt was out of her mind. He glanced round for something to use as a weapon should the need arise, and finding nothing better to choose from than a plaster bust of the poet Dante and the bottle of Polish spirit, picked up the latter by its neck. Eva held her glass out. "Oh, you are awful," she said. "You're making me tiddly." "Quite," said the vicar, and put the bottle down again hastily. It was bad enough being alone in the house with a large, drunk, semi-naked woman who imagined that her husband had murdered her and who confessed to sins that he'd previously only read about, without her jumping to the conclusion that he was deliberately trying to make her drunk. The Reverend St. John Froude had no desire to figure prominently in next Sunday's News of the World. "You were saying that your husband murdered—" He stopped. That seemed an unprofitable subject to pursue. "How could he have murdered me?" asked Eva. "I'm here in the flesh, aren't I?" "Definitely," said the vicar. "Most definitely." "Well, then," said Eva. "And anyway, Henry couldn't murder anyone. He wouldn't know how. He can't even change a fuse in a plug. I have to do everything like that in the house." She stared at the vicar balefully. "Are you married?" "No," said the Reverend St. John Froude, wishing to hell that he was. "What do you know about life if you aren't married?" asked Eva truculently. The Polish spirit was getting to her now, and with it there came a terrible sense of grievance. "Men? What good are men? They can't even keep a house tidy. Look at this room, I ask you." She waved her arms to emphasize the point, and the dust cover dropped. "Just look at it." But the Reverend St. John Froude had no eyes for the room. What he could see of Eva was enough to convince him that his life was in danger. He bounded from the chair, trod heavily on an occasional table, overturned the waste-paper basket, and threw himself through the door into the hall. As he stumbled away in search of sanctuary, the front doorbell rang. The Reverend St. John Froude opened it and stared into Inspector Flint's face. "Thank God you've come," he gasped. "She's in there." The inspector and two uniformed constables went across the hall. Wilt followed uneasily. This was the moment he'd been dreading. In the event, it was better than he expected. Not so for Inspector Flint. He entered the study and found himself confronted by a large, naked woman. "Mrs. Wilt," he began, but Eva was staring at the two uniformed constables. "Where's my Henry?" Eva shouted. "You've got my Henry!" She hurled herself forward. Unwisely, the inspector attempted to restrain her. "Mrs. Wilt, if you would just—" A blow on the side of his head ended the sentence. "Keep your hands off me," yelled Eva, and putting her knowledge of judo to good use, hurled him to the floor. She was about to repeat the performance with the constables when Wilt thrust himself forward. "Here I am, dear," he said. Eva stopped in her tracks. For a moment she quivered, and, seen from Inspector Flint's viewpoint, appeared to be about to melt. "Oh, Henry," she said, "what have they been doing to you?" "Nothing at all, dear," said Wilt. "Now get your clothes on. We're going home." Eva looked down at herself, shuddered, and allowed him to lead her out of the room. Slowly and wearily, Inspector Flint got to his feet. He knew now why Wilt had put that bloody doll down the hole, and why he had sat so confidently through days and nights of interrogation. After 12 years of marriage to Eva Wilt, the urge to commit homicide, if only by proxy, would be overwhelming. And as for Wilt's ability to stand up to cross-examination, it was self-evident. But the inspector knew, too, that he would never be able to explain it to anyone else. There were mysteries of human relationships that defied analysis, and Wilt had stood there calmly and told her to get her clothes on. With a grudging sense of admiration, Flint went out into the hall. The little sod had guts, whatever else you could say about him. They drove back to Parkview Avenue in silence. In the back seat, Eva, wrapped in a blanket, slept with her head lolling on Wilt's shoulder. Beside her, Henry Wilt sat proudly. A woman who could silence Inspector Flint with one swift blow to the head was worth her weight in gold, and besides, that scene in the study had given him the weapon he needed, naked and drunk in a vicar's study. There would be no questions now about why he put that doll down the hole. No accusations, no recriminations. The entire episode would be relegated to the best forgotten, and with it would go all doubts about his virility or his ability to get on in the world. It was checkmate. For a moment, Wilt almost lapsed into sentimentality and thought of love, before recalling just how dangerous a topic that was. He would be better off sticking to indifference and undisclosed affection. Let sleeping dogs lie, he muttered. It was an opinion shared by the Pringheims. As they were helped from the cruiser to a police launch, as they climbed ashore, as they explained to a sceptical Inspector Flint how they had come to be marooned for a week in Eel's Stretch in a boat that belongs to someone else, they were strangely uncommunicative. No, they did not know how the door of the bathroom had been bust down. Well, maybe there had been an accident. They had been too drunk to remember. A doll? What doll? Grass? You mean marijuana? They had no idea. In their house? Inspector Flint let them go, finally. "I'll be seeing you again when the charges have been properly formulated," he said, grimly. The Pringheims left for Rossiter Grove to pack. They flew out of Heathrow next morning. 21. The principal sat behind his desk and regarded Wilt incredulously. "Promotion?" he said. "Did I hear you mention the word promotion?" "You did," said Wilt. "And what is more, you also heard Head of Liberal Studies, too." "After all you've done? You mean to say you have the nerve to come in here and demand to be made Head of Liberal Studies?" "Yes," said Wilt. The principal struggled to find words to match his feelings. It wasn't easy. In front of him was the man who was responsible for the series of disasters that had put an end to his fondest hopes. The tech would never be a Polly now. The Joint Honours Degree's rejection had seen to that. And then there had been the adverse publicity, the cut in the budget, his battles with the Education Committee, the humiliation of being heralded as the principal of Dollfuckers Hall. "You're fired!" he shouted. Wilt smiled. "I think not. Here are my terms." "Your what?" "Terms," said Wilt. "In return for my appointment as Head of Liberal Studies, I shall not institute proceedings against you for unfair dismissal, with all the attendant publicity that would entail. I shall withdraw my case against the police for unlawful arrest. The contract I have here with the Sunday Post for a series of articles on the true nature of liberal studies, I intend to call them Exposure to Barbarism, will remain unsigned. I will cancel the lectures I'd promised to give for the Sex Education Centre. I will not appear on Panorama next Monday. In short, I will abjure the pleasures and rewards of public exposure." The principal raised a shaky hand. "Enough," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Wilt got to his feet. "Let me know your answer by lunchtime," he said. "I'll be in my office." "Your office?" said the principal. "It used to belong to Mr. Morris," said Wilt, and closed the door. Behind him, the principal picked up the phone. There had been no mistaking the seriousness of Wilt's threats. He would have to hurry. Wilt strolled down the corridor to the Liberal Studies Department and stood looking at the books on the shelves. There were changes he had in mind. The Lord of the Flies would go, and with it Shane, Women in Love, Orwell's essays, and Catcher in the Rye, all those symptoms of intellectual condescension, those dangled worms of sensibility. In future, Gas Fitters 1 and Meat 2 would learn the how of things, not the why. How to read and write, how to make beer, how to fiddle their income tax returns, how to cope with the police when arrested, how to make an incompatible marriage work. Wilt would give the last 2 lessons himself. There would be objections from the staff, even threats of resignation, but it would make no difference. He might well accept several resignations from those who persisted in opposing his ideas. After all, you didn't require a degree in English literature to teach gas fitters of the how of anything. Come to think of it, they'd taught him more than they had learnt from him, much more. He went into Mr. Morris's empty office and sat down at the desk and composed a memorandum to Liberal Studies staff. It was headed Notes on a System of Self-Teaching for Day-Release Classes. He had just written non-hierarchical for the 5th time when the phone rang. It was a principal. "Thank you," said the new head of Liberal Studies. Eva Wilt walked gaily up Parkview Avenue from the doctor's office. She had made breakfast for Henry, and hoovered the front room, and polished the hall, and cleaned the windows, and harpicked the loo, and been round to the Harmony Community Centre, and helped with Xeroxing an appeal for a new playgroup, and had done the shopping, and paid the milkman, and been to the doctor to ask if there was any point in taking a course of fertility drugs. And there was. Of course, we'll have to do the tests, the doctor had told her, but there's no reason to think they'll prove negative. The only danger is that you might have sextuplets. It wasn't a danger to Eva. It was what she had always wanted, a house full of children. And all at once, Henry would be pleased. And so the sun shone brighter, the sky was bluer, the flowers in the garden were rosier, and even Parkview Avenue itself seemed to have taken on a new and brighter aspect. It was one of Eva Wilt's better days. 1.